don't mean to make light of such a serious topic, but you know me, I can't really help myself. I've been thinking about getting an exorcism because I've got a little mischievous side of me. And I assume that this is the result of supernatural foul play. There's just no other explanation. But before I make my final decision, I have a couple of questions I need to ask and get answered. First, are exorcisms covered by my insurance? Second, if I don't pay my exorcist, will I get repossessed? I know, that was what you've been waiting for. These are questions I need to get answered before I call the Vatican. Now, of course, I'm teasing. I don't think I need an exorcism, but I do wonder, would a person who needs an exorcism be aware of their need for an exorcism? Now, in case you didn't see the movie way back in the 1970s, an exorcism is the act of expelling an evil spirit or spirits from a person. By the way, I remember going to see the movie The Exorcist because my roommate hyperventilated while we were watching the movie. And so my cousin Richie and we drug him out to the parking lot and stuffed him in the back seat of our car so we could continue watching the movie. True story. If exorcisms are real, the question that really needs answering is, well, where do the spirits go? Assuming that they are real, or as our gospel reading today calls them, unclean spirits, we can assume that they either go back to where they came from, wherever that is, or they jump into the nearest person, which perhaps is an unfortunate priest, or they inhabit a herd of pigs, and therefore the pigs then jump off the cliff. And you remember that story in the gospel readings, I'm sure. Seriously, are exorcisms a real thing? Now, I'm not going to be able to answer that question with any amount of certainty, but I think there are at least three possible answers to that question. The first possible answer is that exorcisms are indeed real, and yet they seem to occur primarily in Roman Catholic or Pentecostal settings in third world countries. That's where they all happen for the most part. Does the fact that most exorcisms are reported among poor and uneducated folks in third world countries discredit the reality of demon possession and or exorcisms? That's a question that people have been asking for a long time. The second possible answer to that question is yes, they did occur in the past, but they no longer occur today. Now, this theory is called the cessationist view, like they have ceased to happen anymore. Cessationists believe that miracles, including exorcisms, used to happen back in the biblical days, which is why we read about them in the Bible, but they no longer happen today. And I always thought that view was a little too convenient. It was just sort of a way to say, oh, this is why it doesn't happen today. It happened back then, but not today. And there's really no good reason why they don't happen today if they happened back then. But the third possible answer is that exorcisms really are not real, that they are stories that we hear about, both ancient and modern, but they're really about psychological phenomena rather than spiritual events. In other words, a possessed person might be a seriously mentally ill person, and that's just the way they understood it back in biblical times. And I think we have to seriously consider that as a possible answer as well. Nevertheless, there are folks out there who claim to perform actual exorcisms, and one of my favorites is the Vatican-trained exorcist, Father Vincent Lampert. He's from the Indianapolis diocese, and he's one of 50 such trained Catholic exorcists in the country, approximately. He says that it helps to have a sense of humor when one is staring down evil. For example, when he He gives talks about exorcisms to big crowds, and when he does so, he will introduce his assistant Mary by telling his audience, "She's my exorcistant." Chill on that a minute. And he also claims that, unlike the movies, he never does exorcisms in a scary place, like an abandoned house or in a dead-end street at midnight or something like that. And finally, this is my favorite factoid. He says that after a particularly difficult exorcism, he likes to stop by the local Dairy Queen for a chocolate milkshake. Well, who wouldn't, right? Now, you might be thinking, Jimmy, you're having way too much fun with this topic, and I confess to that. I am. But all kidding aside, I assure you that I think there is real evil in the world. And I'm not sure evil can be expelled from a person's body with a little holy water and a little anointing with oil, but we do encounter evil, real evil in the world. And it's a cliche to say that all you have to do to encounter evil is to turn on the 6 o'clock news. I mean, certainly the news constantly draws our attention to the weaknesses and the shortcomings and the sinful nature of humanity in all of its ugly forms. And yet sometimes you hear a story and it seems to go a little deeper than just the normal evil that we see. It seems to go to a place that can only be described as pure evil. For example, the recent story of David and Louise Turpin, that California couple, used to live in Texas, who kept their 13 children, you all know this story, hidden from public all these years, chained to their bedposts and whatever, starved them to death. They were malnourished. I think this is a case in point. If that's not evil, I don't know what is. Somebody asked me at the door this morning, how does evil find one another? I mean, how did that couple get together and come to that conclusion that you should treat your children that way? And I'm sure there's people out there that say, well, they're demon-possessed. Yeah, maybe so. Ironically, what I read, that they are some kind of religious extremists, and so there's that. And my guess is they will undergo some psychological testing while they're in prison to see what made them do what they did to their children. And by the way, evil and religious extremism, for some odd reason, seem to go hand in hand a lot of times. There's this television show that started this past week about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. I was there when it happened. I know all about it. But this reveals an obvious example, I think, of the connection between religious extremism and evil. Happens a lot. And maybe there are already professionally trained exorcists just lining up to get a crack at the Turpins. And that's all well and good, maybe even harmless. However, in the meantime, you and I, people who are not trained exorcists, we will encounter evil from time to time in our lives. And when we do, what do we do? How do we do that? What are we supposed to do? A good question to ask is, what does Jesus' encounter with the man in the synagogue in Capernaum teach us about encountering evil? Evil is not always apparent. Sometimes it's very subtle. We don't really know what's happening. And yet in this case, it was very apparent. The gospel writer Mark tells us that one day Jesus is teaching in the synagogue. This is probably his first teaching experience out in public, and it was people's first, just glimpse of who this man was. And so the audience was in awe, sort of like you are right now. And there's something special about the way that Jesus is teaching these people, not like those scribes who are just up there monotone, giving out their little rules. This guy had some serious chops. He knew what he was talking about. But in the audience, though, there's this man who doesn't really seem to appreciate very much what Jesus is talking about. And Mark says that he has an unclean spirit. That is, in that world, he is possessed. So he gets in Jesus' face. Imagine the scene. You're just rocking along teaching, And he stands up and he gets in his face and he screams at him and he says, "What have you to do with us?" By the way, notice the plural word there, because I think the writer's trying to say he had multiple demons running around in his belly. "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" In other words, destroy evil. "I know who you are. Your disciples may not know who you are just yet. This is your first sermon, by the way, but I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." Isn't it interesting how evil can often recognize what's not evil, what's the opposite, what is a threat to them? A true story, I can kind of relate here to Jesus, minus the Holy One of God part. That doesn't come into the story, but I can relate to what happened here. Years ago, I was a pastor in Terre Haute, Indiana, and I would often go down to the local university, which is Indiana State University, and I would give lectures and participate in panel discussions and things like that. They would invite me to come because I had a degree in ethics, and many of the topics they talked about were ethical issues like war and human sexuality and things like that, the stuff that I studied in grad school. And so they would bring me in. Well, one day, I was a guest lecturer in a class, and we were talking about human sexuality, specifically such things as gay marriage and transgender issues, things like that. All of a sudden, we're just having a good conversation, and this student, she stood up from her desk, and she started preaching at me, which, okay. But interspersed with her Bible quotes, she was yelling and she was cursing at me, which is kind of interesting. They're quoting the Bible and cursing at the same time. It's kind of a fun thing. And then she continued to do so as she walked past me on her way out the door. And everybody's just stunned. What is this girl doing? It was interesting. She obviously did not get the spirit of detached, unemotional classroom discussion in the context of higher education, but she did seem to have another spirit. And I thought to myself, if I had been an exorcist rather than an ethicist, I might have done more good that day. Nevertheless, so yeah, I can sort of relate to Jesus' experience in the synagogue as this man with an unclean spirit is standing in front of him and screaming at the top of his lungs. But Jesus' response is very clear and simple. Be silent and come out of him. It sounds fairly easy, doesn't it? And apparently it works. According to the story, the unclean spirit leaves the man. This tactic probably wouldn't work for us when we encounter what we suspect might be some manifestation of evil. And yet, it's not Jesus' tactic that really instructs us here in the story, because none of us are going to go into the exorcism business. If you do, I'd like to go along with you on a couple of your outings, but I doubt if any of us are going to do that. What instructs us in this story is the fact that he did not ignore the man in the first place. He did not ignore the man. That's our natural response. We don't like to confront evil. Or if we do, we don't have as much compassion and understanding as Jesus did. Instead, we like to fight fire with fire. We like to meet force with more force. We assume the evil in front of us is our enemy, and we treat him as such if we pay any attention to him in the first place. But that's what we do. So I think we can learn, bottom line here, we can learn two things from Jesus' encounter with this man that, according to Mark, has an unclean spirit. First, don't ignore them. Pay attention to them. Focus on them. Second, though, this is important, do so with compassion. Understand that the evil we see in a person likely has roots somewhere else. You know, we are told that it takes a village to raise a child. I say it takes a village to raise a villain. There is a reason why people are the way they are. The Turpins, for example, are not just evil for the sake of being evil. They didn't wake up one morning and look at each other and say, let's be evil to our beautiful little children. There is likely something in their past that warped them. And I think the same is true, for example, for the young man who opened fire on his classmates in Kentucky last week. And the same is true for the man who tried to destroy Jesus' ministry day one in that synagogue a long time ago in Capernaum. But like Jesus, we need to show compassion to those we deem to have unclean spirits. Confronting evil, Jesus style, means approaching the unapproachable and loving the unlovable. Somehow we have to retrain our brains to understand that those who seem hell-bent on tormenting others are often tormented themselves. So no, I'm not likely to start performing exorcism, even as a side job. I'm pretty sure I don't have the skill set to do that. However, I do, like you, have the skill set needed to look evil in the eye and show some compassion. And that's all Jesus is asking of each one of us. Amen.